With our Wednesday NHL Insider from TSN and the Ray and Dregs Hockey Podcast, our pleasure to welcome back to the show, Mr. Darren Dreger. How you doing?
I'm doing well, guys. How are you?
Yeah, very, very well. So since we last talked to you, Bruce Boudreau is back and has done a press conference. And in fact, it was last week where you told us that maybe ownership and management was getting a little bit antsy waiting on Bruce's decision. How did all this come together in the end, as you know it, Dregs?
Yeah, well, there's no doubt that they were starting to get antsy. I don't think that there was any bad blood between the two sides. It's just, from an ownership or a management perspective, you feel like there should be a sense of obligation. And it's not like Bruce or his agent Gil Scott had free reign. Like, they couldn't call all of the teams with potential coaching vacancies and say, hey, are you interested in my guy? That's not the way it works, because Bruce was still under contract, right? So even though he had the opt-in clause, they would have had to have gone through the Vancouver Canucks to make that happen, and that wasn't the case. So I think that it just became abundantly clear that if Bruce was going to pursue outside interest, if he believed there was going to be outside interest, he would have then had to have opted out. But I think that, he's handled this thing the way he should have. And, he has to accept a good amount of the credit for how the team responded when they moved out Travis Green and Boudreau came in. He deserves some of the credit. Are there some things that are going to need to change from a coaching perspective and how they prepare and all of those things? Yeah, probably. But I'm sure that, Bruce is going to be engaged and ready to accept that level of responsibility as well. I just think that it came to a point last week, probably leading up to the conversation we had a week ago, where Bruce knew that, he had to just end the speculation and make the decision. And as the old saying goes, bird in the hand, right? So he knows that he's got at least 1 year with the Vancouver Canucks, and just gambling on what may or may not surface for him, that was too rich of a gamble, based on the fact that, he was on the outside for a long, long time before Francesco Aquilini contacted him and brought him into Vancouver.
And the irony here is, based on what management may need to do to clear out cap space and build a contender, Bruce may be looking at a younger team next year, a team that doesn't quite have the firepower of this year's team. He's sort of known as more of a right now coach, and he may have to be more of a developmental coach next year, depending on what they do this offseason.
No, I think that's bang on, Matt. I think that the window is completely open here for all sorts of different approaches from a Canucks perspective. There was so much speculation around, names like Besser and JT Miller and go down the list, right, leading up to the trade deadline. And, the Canucks didn't engage in any of that because they wanted to make sure that those pieces were in the fight and trying to lock down a playoff spot. So you go into the offseason, if you're Patrick Allvin and Jim Rutherford, again, with basically an empty canvas. You have a pretty sound idea on what the direction of the team needs to be. There's no for sale signs up in Vancouver specific to players, but you do have to be open because of cap implications of what sort of opportunities around the draft might exist. What if Tom Fitzgerald and the New Jersey Devils were willing to talk about the second pick overall, and they had interest in JT Miller? Well, from a management standpoint in Vancouver, how do you not consider that? We appreciate how impactful JT Miller was in the Vancouver Canucks push this season. He had a hell of a year. That's without dispute. But his contract isn't that far away from needing some attention. So do you, maybe push your chips into the direction of going younger and getting a top draft pick, and in the meantime alleviating some of the cap pressure in one fell swoop? Not saying it's going to happen, but I think that those are the things that are, openly being discussed inside hockey operations.
The theme I hear so far about teams recently eliminated are, heck, even in the case of the Canucks themselves, who we've heard this word from I believe Jim Rutherford, is sandpaper, and people wanted a little bit more grit. not like Wayne Simmons kind of grit. Like the Leafs tried that, didn't really work, but I think they want, a player that can play, but it has some sandpaper too. Do you think JT Miller has that reputation league wide? Like, would he be that ingredient for the Kings or Leafs or whomever that's looking for that added grit? Or do you think they're talking about somebody beyond that, a more Nazem Kadri kind of style of player?
Well, look, I mean, he does have that perception, that reputation. But you're right. I mean, he's I wouldn't call him a prototypical power forward, but describe what a power forward is in today's NHL.
Mm-hmm.
I think of Evander Kane in Edmonton, and JT Miller isn't that, but he is known, and his reputation is being a player who's hard to play against, and a very productive one on top of that.
Yep.
So he services a lot of angles. When you think of a complete player, JT Miller is fairly complete. I'm sure that there are parts of his game that Bruce Boudreau or any coach that JT Miller has had to work for would like to get a little bit different, a little bit more out of him in that regard. But it's hard to be critical of his play this past season. And on top of that, not just because he was so productive, I don't know how many calls Patrick Allvin and Jimmy Rutherford fielded on JT Miller, but didn't it seem like we have been talking or were talking about Miller and what team might have interest for much of the year?
Sure,
right?
Absolutely.
Like, I mean, not just around the trade deadline. Well, that's because teams were calling and the interest was there. So it's not because the Vancouver Canucks were shopping them at any point. It was that teams, were reading and hearing some of the speculation on the media front, but then they could use the eye test. And some of the best teams in the league were inquiring on JT Miller because he can provide a little bit of everything. And just that touch of sandpaper, man, especially this time of year in the playoffs, teams are always looking for more of that.
I've never heard it described like this, but I do wish the draft was in late June instead of early July this time around. The extra 2 weeks might have made a difference for the Canucks. Do you try to catch, if you're Jim Rutherford, teams feeling that wound still? Like, the wound covers over a little bit the longer you are away from it if you just got eliminated in the first or second round. Do you still try to address those teams that have the open wound and say, oh, you need this guy, you're more desperate for this guy than you think? Because the longer you are away from that elimination game, you probably start to convince yourself that everything's okay, right?
100%. No question about that. There are hockey operations departments across the NHL, either those that didn't qualify for the playoffs or, I think of the Dallas Stars, recently dispatched any team that lost in the first round. They're not happy about that. How can you be happy about that? And everyone from the top, from ownership through senior management, through the general manager's office, through to the coaching staff, aren't happy about that. I mean, look how long Kelly McCrimmon and George McPhee and Bill Foley and the Vegas Golden Knights took to decide that Pete DeBoer was no longer the right fit as head coach. So there is a process that you have to go through. And I'm not connecting Vancouver to Minnesota, but, Bill Guerin and the Minnesota Wild would be a team of interest to me if I was another club that had valuable assets like a JT Miller, because you might get more done with a team like Mini than you might if you're just dealing specifically with a draft pick. And the reason I say that is pretty obvious when you look at the amount of work that Guerin is going to have to do to comply with the salary cap, right? With the hit that they're going to take from Parise and Suter. What is it, around $14 million off their cap for next year? So Minnesota's going to have to make some room. So that's one dynamic. That's one scenario that a team that has assets and is looking to get creative, like Vancouver, I think is. You have to look at all sorts of different connections, not just the obvious, which is moving up in the draft or looking at player X. I mean, I think that the door is open for a lot of clubs, and disappointment is in a big way part of the fueling of that.
Your mini idea is a great idea, although that sounds like that's stage 2 for the Canucks, right? Because Jim Rutherford said, I would love to help out desperate teams. He with a wink, I'd love to help out by taking on their troublesome salary because they're up against the cap. But first, we need to create our own room. So first, he has to find the deal to unload his own cap, and then he calls Mini potentially and helps them out, or teams like Mini, right? So the question is, how does he make that first step happen?
No, fair enough. But again, for the reasons we talked about JT Miller and the type of player he is and how well-rounded he is, if you're Minnesota and you've got to move out several pieces to comply, wouldn't it be nice to get a piece back that could play different aspects of the game? He's not overpriced. Yeah. And I'm telling you, again, when you look at Minnesota, it feels like Guerin and Craig Leopold, the owner there, they almost have to go on a year-by-year approach now moving forward because of the cap compliance and everything that they've got to deal with. So, the lower end of their roster is going to be lower end players, not dissimilar to what the Toronto Maple Leafs have done, right? And bringing in a cheap Mike Bunting and bringing in a cheap Camp, a cheap Kasha, players who are good NHL players, but you don't have them under long term, and they fit nicely in your group. I think that has to be the direction of the Minnesota Wild. So in saying that, maybe there's some other players that have to pop loose, but if many were so inclined, JT Miller might cover off a couple of areas of concern.
Yeah, and I think Fiala might be a player to watch there
For
as
sure.
an RFA who didn't necessarily step up in the playoffs. There's outside of Minnesota, who is, needless to say, a unique scenario. Is there a little more money in the system this summer, Dregs? We've heard dollar in, dollar out so much over the last few years with the pandemic and revenues having taken a hit and cap space being at a premium. Is it a little looser this summer across the league?
Please say yes.
Please.
Well, I'd like to say yes, but I don't have the evidence to say that yet. And I'm definitely not getting that level of feedback from NHL general managers. What there is, though, is a real strong appetite for change. And, we've already seen it with the coaching adjustments that are being made, guys getting fired, the hiring process of some of the teams that are trying to get the jump in that regard. But I think, and this is just a gut feeling based on the number of executives that I talked to around the National Hockey League, that this offseason is going to be as chaotic as we've seen. So dollar in, dollar out does apply when you're looking at bigger deals, but that's not to say that you can't get creative. There are still teams out there that are willing to absorb money, right? Take on bad deals. I still think of Arizona. I still think of Buffalo. Go down the list. So there may not be more free spending per se, which could negatively impact those who are pending unrestricted free agents. But I think we're going to see maybe more player movement in this offseason than we've seen in the past number of years.
On to Pittsburgh, who are done, who have some big-time free agents in Evgeny Malkin and Chris Letang, and perhaps quite importantly, a new ownership group in the Fenway Group, which has shown itself in baseball with Mookie Betts. They're willing to walk from a star player. What are you hearing about the Penguins' offseason game plan?
Yeah, and a real active and involved ownership group too, right? In all of the sports that you've mentioned here, Matt. And I don't think that there's going to be anything different in their approach with the Pittsburgh Penguins. I'm not saying that that's problematic for Ron Hextall and Brian Burke and the group that oversees hockey ops for the Pittsburgh Penguins. But when your owner is more involved and want to engage more in day-to-day hockey decisions, well, that can become problematic, especially when you're talking about, two seasoned veterans like Hextall and Brian Burke. Look, Pittsburgh is a different city. I think of Matt Murray, who's now obviously with the Ottawa Senators. But the reason why Matt Murray became a movable object with the Pittsburgh Penguins is because, his play ward and that he needed to change his scenery. When Ottawa picked him up, I thought he was going to take off again because of the young resume that he had with so much success in winning the Stanley Cups. Now, it hasn't worked out that way for Matt Murray, but a big part of the reason why he struggled was because of how beloved Marc-Andre Fleury was in Pittsburgh. And Fleury had left, right? He's in Vegas, but Pittsburgh has a knack, and it's a good thing. It's a nice quality of really, really going after the beloved. So that would be Malkin, and for sure it would be Chris Letang, and maybe throw Brian Rust into that mix too as a pending unrestricted free agent. That may matter to the fan base, may matter to the market. I don't think it matters to ownership. I think they have a respect level for the service of these individuals and the fact that these guys have helped bring championships to the Pittsburgh Penguins and the city of Pittsburgh. At the end of the day, if you can invest, whatever the dollar is going to be to retain Evgeny Malkin or Chris Letang, if you can invest the same amount of money that you'd have to invest in those two guys in acquiring 4 or 5 other pieces or more, that's kind of the direction that ownership has gone in other sports. So it's going to be fascinating to watch.
Is there a chance that the Seattle Kraken, because it was a kind of a mess season in Seattle, do they go big game hunting for a guy like Malkin? Could the Canucks be facing Evgeny Malkin on a more regular basis?
There's a team with cap space too.
Yeah.
Seattle.
Yeah, I forgot Seattle in talking about Arizona and Buffalo earlier. I mean, I can't say no, but if Evgeny Malkin were to hit the open market, and I don't mean to sound like I've got a tone that suggests it's far-fetched or a long shot, I'm just going by Malkin's media availability exit, right? Where he talked about, how much he wants to stay with the Penguins, finish his career, retire, all that stuff. I get it. But at the end of the day, there's a business decision that has to be made here. Look at Mark Giordano leaving Calgary Flames. It happens. So, if he hits the open market, I don't know why Seattle wouldn't take a run at him, but would they be a primary city fit for Evgeny Malkin? Probably not. Players of that ilk, he's been there, he's done that, he's won. There's a lot of miles on the chassis there, but I suspect that if he knows he's going to have to take less, and it's going to be a short term, obviously, based on where he's at in his career, he's going to look for a fit where he feels like he can contribute, number one, but that the team that he's going to, and it's an enormous if, leaving Pittsburgh, he's going to a team where he can try and win another Stanley Cup.
Wonderful stuff, Dregs. Thank you for this. We will catch up next Wednesday when I suspect more will even be more grist for the mill at that point. Be well, my friend, until next Wednesday.
All right, guys. Thank you.
Darren Dreger of the Rain Dregs Hockey Podcast, TSN Hockey Insider, each and every Wednesday with us. Yes, Blake?
I love the Malkin storyline in so many ways. Ron Francis has ties to Pittsburgh and all that. But the last thing he said is the truest one. Malkin probably wants one last kick at the Stanley Cup, and he's a long way away from that in Seattle.
He's not going to Seattle.
Yeah.
And should be said, Seattle has cap space, but they have some RFAs to re-sign. They're not like as awash in cap space as you might think.
If they're in love with those RFAs, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, I suspect they will re-sign some of these RFAs. I'm not sure if our old buddy Cole Lind will get a deal, but you always just bottom line lesson: whatever cap space is showing, got to account for the RFAs, right? Even if we're eliminating the UFAs, I just think they're too far away for Malkin to consider, right?
Just Eastern Seaboard guy.
No, I mean from a Stanley Cup.
Oh, no, totally. Yeah.
No, I concur with your point. Interesting again, though, JT Miller in Minnesota, and whether or not there's a creative deal to be made there. I agree with you. It may need to be the second piece of the second act of the Canucks offseason. Right. But we shall see. What I do know, as Drag has said, is that the Vancouver Canucks are going to have to consider very creative options here, and particularly if you've read Harman Dial and Thomas Dranson, what they've proposed in The Athletic over the last couple of days about how you go about clearing cap space. It is many options available to you. Some of them bring some short-term pain, and so
not a lot of them easy or straightforward.
No, exactly.